Since we last spoke, of course, there's war in the Ukraine. You've had a bit to do with Vladimir Putin. You've met him on a number of occasions. What's his end game?
Well, I think his view from discussions I'd had with him is that I'd put it together to say he thinks that the West is slowly encroaching upon Russia, and he was concerned about nuclear weapons getting closer to the country, whether that's justified or not. And he thought that it was better to invade now and stop that from happening because he thought that might happen. It's in historical terms, it's not unprecedented. We can look what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. People with nuclear weapons tend not to be so rational, and that puts the stakes up so people can do things that don't need to be done. I mean, I don't think there was any chance of the Ukraine ever joining NATO or the Ukraine ever joining the EU. But the reason economically, because to be in the EU, one Dutchman has the income of 100 Ukrainians. So you wouldn't want to dilute the wealth in the EU if you're in the EU by bringing people in that have much lower living standards. So I don't know whether these were any real threats, but of course Putin saw that. I also guess that he wanted to demonstrate that he was still in charge, both domestically and externally, because you know, when you're in there and you're in charge of a country like that with those sort of methods, one day you're going to have to leave. And you know, what's going to happen to you then? So that's what they're worried about.
And of course you've done a lot of business with the Chinese. You're a student of Chinese history. They're looking on thinking, okay, how does this affect their annexation of Taiwan? Do you think it will accelerate that, or do you think it will? They'll pause now after the sanctions hit Russia so hard?
I don't think it's the sanctions. It's probably the US Navy which will stop them, and they probably know that the United States is a preeminent naval power and they couldn't possibly invade Taiwan, I don't think, and survive. That's probably what stops them. The Chinese Communist Party tends to be a ruthless group of people who are solely concerned with their outcome for them personally, whether it's inside or outside China, and are prepared to go to any lengths to conduct court cases to utilise our Western system against us, because they're hell-bent on getting control of our country and our resources, I think.
Opposition leader Anthony Albanese says he wants to govern using the template of the Palaszczuk government. What does that mean for Australia?
Disaster. It means disaster for this country. Of course, elections are important to hold politicians to account, to know what their program is and know what you're voting for. Nobody knows what Albo is going to do. We just know that he's further left than Bill Shorten. We can just look at Shorten's policies at the last election, and we've got to tell Albo he's dreaming. Although he's lost weight, and I admire him for doing that and having the mental courage, he needs to be honest with the Australian people and tell them what are the Labor policies, what do they intend to do. And I mean, the Liberal Party is hopeless. To give a budget for 6 months really tells everybody there's going to be a new one in 6 months, and we're going to tell you the truth. We're going to really lock you down economically and maybe physically.
Your advertising campaign during the 2019 election, when you referred to Bill Shorten as Shifty Bill, definitely had an impact, and certainly in Queensland. How much are you going to spend this time around, and what will be your narrative this time?
Well, our narrative is that there are a couple of very important things for this election that the major parties have avoided. One is, how do we retire our debt with no impact on the economy, no impact on families, and how do we then make sure that interest rates do not make us devoid of property in this country? It changes from a home ownership country to people who are slaves in our own country. We've got to look at that question. And most importantly, how do we unlock $1 trillion, say, of capital and have that returned to Australia to ensure that we've got real jobs? I mean, it's no achievement to say that the job market is full now, because I've done two things. I brought wages down in real terms to the lowest they've ever been in this country. Our wages at the moment are equivalent to what they were 10 years ago. How can families matter? As you bring the wages down lower and lower, you get full employment. I mean, in countries in Asia where the price of labour is very cheap, they've got full employment too. But what's the cost? It's a cost of our living standard. It's a cost of our values and who we are. And no one's looking at that.
If there's a hung parliament, if you hold the balance of power, would you go with Morrison or would you go with Albanese?
We'd go with the people that will introduce our policies for this country, because the reason we're standing is because there is a large debt, that housing rates are going to increase, that Australians are going to be dispossessed. We want to stop that from happening. We've got a solution in that which we'll present at the press club, and whoever's going to introduce that we've got to put the benefit of the Australian people first, and that's who we'd go with.
Why did you go with freedom, freedom, freedom? What does the freedom line represent to you and to your members?
Well, freedom, I think, is not just about what we saw in the pandemic. It's about the freedom to own a home, freedom to work. And work's a privilege. Freedom to decide what happens with your family and how you distribute your wealth. Freedom to participate, to be respected. And we know how much the Liberal Party respects Australians at the moment with their $1.60 a week. If that's all you think you're worth, you can vote again for the Liberal Party. But if you believe, as I do, that Australians should have the right to protect themselves, to aspire for all they could be, and to make Australia the country that it could become, you should vote for the United Australia Party.
You came up with Shifty Bill for Bill Shorten at the last election. Have you got a line for Anthony Albanese?
Well, I think you'd have to say he's awful elbow. That would certainly go together, because it's awful that he doesn't come to the Australian people with his program. He doesn't say what he will do. It's like voting for a black box. You don't know what you'll get. And we do know what we will get with Morrison: arrogance, lies, and destruction of our society. So they're not two good choices for the community. So we think that you should vote for the United Australia Party. And regardless of what the media said, regardless of what the so-called polls say, you'll see on election night that, because there's a movement across this country that wants to protect and defend our values as a nation, that wants to make sure that their family can be provided for, that they can have their own home, that they're not going to be pillaged by international financiers, that they can protect and defend Australia. And I'm sure they'll come to the polls.
Clive Palmer, thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Peter. All the best.